You still think your rent renewal is a negotiation. That is the trick. The email lands, the portal updates, the number jumps. You call the leasing office because that is what people do when they still believe there is a human decision somewhere in the chain. And the voice on the other end sounds polite, maybe even sympathetic, but the answer has that strange dead quality to it. No flexibility, no real movement, no actual bargaining. Just the soft language of a conversation wrapped around something that already feels decided. That feeling is the story, because this is not really about rent being expensive. It is about the place where negotiation used to live and whether that place has quietly been moved somewhere else, upstream, into software. And federal investigators have now put that mechanism under a spotlight. For years, the public explanation for rising rent was simple. Supply is tight, demand is strong, prices rise, clean story. But federal and state enforcers are now describing something more specific. In August 2024, the Justice Department sued RealPage. Then the case widened. In January 2025, the government expanded it. That was the first signal that this was bigger than one company. In November 2025, DOJ announced a proposed settlement. The case kept moving. Then, on March 2, 2026, a federal court entered a final judgment against Greystar. This means the argument is no longer theoretical. The question is no longer whether software exists in housing. Of course it does. The timeline matters for a different reason. It tells you where the real fight is, not over whether landlords use technology, not over whether the market is competitive in the abstract. The fight is over whether software started shaping the decision surface itself, whether the number was still being discovered in the conversation or delivered to it. The real question is what happens when competing landlords begin operating through the same pricing logic, a shared rail, a common recommendation system, a machine that absorbs market data from multiple players and pushes out guidance about rents, renewals, and occupancy. And once enough of the market begins relying on that machine, something subtle starts to happen at the exact point where renters and managers still meet face to face. Because the old assumption was that a manager could look at your situation and make a judgment, maybe not a generous judgment, but a human one. What the government describes is a system where that judgment becomes narrower, where software processes non-public market signals and generates recommendations that managers are encouraged to follow. The manager opens a dashboard. It shows a recommended rate and an acceptable range. The training is to quote from it, not around it. DOJ filings allege the software was built to process competitors' sensitive data. The output, unit-level pricing recommendations, generated automatically, delivered to managers. The government also describes features designed to limit price decreases or otherwise push outcomes toward higher rents. In some cases, the system could even accept fewer leases while maintaining higher prices. Weak demand does not always mean lower rent. Sometimes it means holding the line and protecting yield. That is not just pricing, that is governance. Because once the system defines the acceptable range, negotiation does not disappear, it just stops being the thing that determines the outcome. DOJ also alleges the software ecosystem discouraged concessions and trained leasing staff to quote from pricing matrices rather than negotiate around them. The renter calling the leasing office does not know any of this. They only know the number did not move. The renter still hears a human voice. But the human voice may be standing downstream from a system that has already narrowed the answer. And that is exactly the texture renters describe. You call expecting discretion. You receive procedure. You ask for flexibility. They repeat the number. You ask if anyone can adjust it. And the answer arrives politely, professionally, and with a tone that suggests the real decision has already happened somewhere else. Part of what makes this effective is that the ritual still feels familiar. The office is still there. The portal still looks ordinary. The person on the phone still sounds like a person who could help. That is why renters keep believing discretion exists, not because they are naive, Because every visible part of the system still performs the old script: a manager, a desk, a phone number, a renewal conversation. All the theater of judgment remains in place. What changes is the amount of judgment still allowed to happen inside it. That is the death of negotiation. Not negotiation disappearing on paper. Negotiation becoming theater. The ritual survives. The outcome is already constrained. And once that shift happens, the market begins to feel different. Not just expensive, non-negotiable. And once enough renters started describing the same experience, the pressure had somewhere to land. Different buildings, different managers, same dead-end answer. And that is why lawmakers started moving, not against software in general, against the coordination layer underneath it. California targeted common pricing algorithms. New York targeted algorithmic devices performing a coordinating function. San Francisco targeted algorithmic rent setting directly, because once the market runs through a shared pricing system, power does not disappear. It moves away from the visible conversation into the system behind it. The leasing office remains. The phone number remains. The friendly email remains. The human layer stays exactly where it was, but the real judgment may already live somewhere else. This is not just a housing story. It is a system story. It's a design pattern spreading across the essential services of our lives. Different sector, same machine. In healthcare, the machine is used to exhaust you, a black box wearing families down in the appeal process until they simply give up. In housing, it's used to hollow you out, a black box removing your ability to bargain while leaving the theater of the leasing office intact. The sector changes. The pattern does not. And that pattern is the real investigation, because the deepest change is not that software exists. The deepest change is that software starts deciding where discretion is allowed to live. Once that happens, the apartment stops being just shelter. It becomes a terminal that can quote a number, enforce a range, suppress deviation, and present the result as if it simply emerged from the natural weather of the market. That is the trick. The system does not need to announce itself as coordination, and it does not need every landlord to be part of it. It only needs to feel like inevitability. It only needs enough adoption, enough shared logic, and enough managerial obedience to make bargaining weaker than it used to be. Not dead everywhere, dead often enough, dead quietly enough, dead behind a screen. So no, the clean takeaway is not that every rent increase is illegal, and it is not that every landlord is colluding. That would be lazy thinking. The sharper takeaway is this: when competitors rely on a shared pricing system built on sensitive shared data, the market can stop feeling like a market at the exact point where ordinary people touch it. The renter still sees a renewal notice, still hears a manager, still receives a polite explanation, but the real bargaining layer may already be gone. And when that bargaining layer disappears, more disappears with it, not just a chance at a lower number. A sense that explanation still matters, a sense that history still matters. That is what silent governance takes. A sense that being early, reliable, cooperative, or willing to stay might still count for something. That is what makes non-negotiable feel so cold. It is not just the price. It is the absence of any visible place where a different outcome can still be argued into existence. What disappears here is not just haggling. It is the small layer of social judgment that once sat between the number and the person receiving it. The chance that context might matter. The chance that a long lease, a clean record, or a willingness to stay could still change the answer. All of that used to exist in that conversation. The chance that a manager could look at a situation and decide that keeping a tenant was worth more than defending a model. When that layer goes missing, the market does not just feel hard, it feels sealed. And once that happens, rent does not just rise. Negotiation dies first, then the number arrives.